Yes, it's quite a small city, and it's true what Professor Balsavar said today. It's quite an intimate city streetscape, small buildings, historic feel, and that breezy next to the ocean feel. And it was quite a diverse place too. Firstly, I think just sitting today, listening to all the students talk about their work, reminded me of how difficult it is to design a monument. It seems like a simple thing. Historically, a monument was a statue with a horse and a soldier on it or something like that. That was the reference for a monument. And I think what all the students managed to do is to get the idea that it's actually an experience, and so that a monument has to be more than an object. It has to be a sequence. It has to have nuance in it. It has to have intuition in it. And it also has to appeal to different generations. And I think that's probably the most difficult challenge. How do you build something for an architect that passed away at 94, where the population of India is a young population? So the people that's going to experience a monument like that is not the people who knew Correa, not even the students who did the submission generally knew who he was, because they were still at school when he passed away, possibly. I'm speculating. And so we come with maybe a bit of baggage, knowing more about Charles Correa, having preconceived ideas about who he is and what he would have expected. So to an extent, the challenge for us as the jurors was to stand back from that, to say how can this be independently appreciated by anybody, regardless of the Correa building, but the clues of the Correa building that influenced the building was also done exceptionally well, because some of the students clearly wanted to show us, or the entrants wanted to show us how they researched Correa. For us, it's more intuitive. If you've seen Correa's work over 30 years of practicing architecture in bits, you read a book, you read an article, you see an interview, you listen to him speak, you develop quite a profound understanding of who he is. And the other two jurors even more so than I do, having worked with him, having known him personally. So in that sense, it was a very difficult. So they had to deal with this double challenge of designing what any monument is difficult enough as it is, and then it's burdened with this cultural thing about would this have upset Charles Correa if he saw it? Because as one of the entrants said, he didn't actually want anything on that site in front of the building, because that's what he responded to when he designed this building, almost like a tree and a breezeway towards the river. So the site was actually quite cheeky, if I can put it that way. And it's in a cheeky way was also included a big tree. So all these things were thrown at the students as things that they had to respond to. Some of them missed some of these. It's almost like a game where all these elements are there, and some of them were seen and sort of acknowledged, and others weren't. But in the time available, and one must also not forget that the time wasn't that much. The time was limited, and Professor Balsavar spoke about some of them maybe wanting to continue the work and elaborate further, and I'm sure some of them would. And we only saw 10 now. So again, I would have loved to have seen the others, and also the level of application to that site, because in the end, the winner was fairly reductive in its response to the site and fairly minimalist, if I can use that term. What spectrum of all the entries, of more than 400, would have taken that approach? Because some of the entries today that we saw tried to be as comprehensive in its acknowledgement of the legacy of Correa as possible. And that created for them quite a challenge, because they wrote a brief that was so complex, the monument, the existing site, plus trying to be everything that Correa was about in one monument. And that was exceptionally difficult thing to deal with, but they worked through that, and we saw those responses. The collaboration between professional architects in practice, plus a corporate or a business, a construction company, plus academia, the university where we're based at the moment, is quite profound. And the level of tolerance between those three tiers within a competition is quite unique, I believe. Because usually you would have a big corporate sponsoring it, and then they would take full control. And I've seen the respect between these tiers, and that's what we all want as architects in practice, me speaking as an architect. So this is almost like a metaphor of what practice should be. And I think the fact that it's in its seventh year and everybody's enjoying it, all three sides are enjoying it. So why can't we achieve the same thing in practice? Why is this the suspicion? Don't trust the architect too much. Don't trust the builder too much. The academics are too frivolous. They are too airy-headed about things. And this shows how this could be very practical, because the theme was a very practical one. It was a very real site, and it was also in the context of a very real, sober architect in Charles Correa. So that mix is something that I also see in the culture of for me coming from South Africa to adjudicate, I find that very inspiring, and I wish we could have that dynamic in South Africa. No, what happened is it actually came about through my interest in Charles Correa's work. I gave a talk which was posted online on YouTube. My colleague in South Africa, my good friend Peter Rich, who's also a good friend of Nandan Balsavar, then mentioned my work to him. He then forwarded that video clip to the drawing board, and so I got invited. So it's actually quite authentic in the sense that it's through my interest in the theme of this year's competition. So it's very specific to my interest in Correa, which is not coincidental, because I've really been a big admirer of his work. And some of the other people that saw my work today said that there is a connection and a link, something that I can relate to in the way that I work in South Africa. No, not really. I took it on its own merits. So I think that's what one needs to do. And I also think it was also the opportunity to network and to get to know people in India. And I think that's also very important. I think post-COVID, we were all yearning for that, because a lot of the stuff happened online, as some people said today. The previous versions were done online, and I wasn't aware of that. It's just nice the way it's been organized, that there's an openness to invite somebody from the outside, to trust that person, especially with this concept of the competition for this year. And then for me to be part of the debate today, because as Professor Balsavar said earlier, it's not really a competition in the normal sense, because the format was actually a discussion and a debate with recurring themes and recurring challenges and so on. So I've learned from my fellow jurors, from everybody that's here, Sachin and Professor Balsavar, and so that was the spirit in which the competition was staged. Yes, I think the students that communicate design at that age, they're not aware of their shortcomings. They're quite optimistic. That's good. That's the benefit of youth. You engage, you're quite bold, you take chances, you go for it, you believe in yourself. But what's interesting about your question, and I made the comment this morning in one of the presentations about the work seems like it's fairly close to the way that Correa would have appreciated things done, but the way it's presented lacks that poetic calmness that comes with experience, reflectiveness, and assuredness about the principles that you support. So those principles in time become more intuitive, and when they're intuitive, it's much easier to talk about them. When you're younger, you still have to negotiate your way through many principles to define which 5 or 6 of those principles are out there, a whole sea of principles, or those that appeal to you. And maybe we can talk about like-mindedness, because I think my involvement here is in a spirit of like-mindedness. But what I do know, the students that participated and those students that came into the final 8, they will not forget this experience. They will keep on looking at the entry, they will reflect on it, they will remember the comments, and will definitely influence the way that they look at architecture. And that's what's so interesting, is formal education in architecture is actually quite limited. What you learn at university doesn't have the praxis component, it doesn't have the practical experience, all the failures. It's all very sort of idealistic sometimes, when it's in the undergraduate phase especially. So the comments were often made today that, we're almost talking to you like We're talking to mature architects that are already in practice. And in a way, it's our work to do that, to try and raise that standard higher. And I think that the level of debate made that possible, and also the freedom to discuss it. Because if we had a checklist of 6 items and we all agreed on the checklist and it arrived here and we said no, right, yes, and we added it all up, it would have been a very disappointing outcome. And sometimes that's what students expect. I'm not saying that these students specifically. It depends on where the education is. And so it gave me a really big sense of comfort around where education in architecture in India is. Because I find there's quite a bit of, a lot of generosity in terms of sharing ideas, listening, being inspired, and also appreciating architects that practiced in a previous generation, because that's also part of the crisis of architecture now in the digital age, is that there's not that in the past there would be a few architects that people would know them and they would be a common point of reference, and the benefit of that, it allows for refinement. You know, that you're not always looking for the new next star. You know, where's the next star, and you're following the stars all the time. So you don't consolidate your position. In the past, that was because of the information was much more limited. An architect like Charles Correa was much more in focus. So I find it quite inspiring that younger architects see the value in that work, which is actually a previous generation's work. But it's also saying there's something wrong with the way that we build buildings and how we practice as architects. There's something of value in the way that generation did architecture, which was calmer, it was more poetic, it was less concerned with bigness and scale. And that's part of the problem at the moment. Things are big, developments are big. So the poetic, the small, the poem that we spoke about is getting lost in all the noise. But as I said, I was very encouraged coming from the outside, having a day of focus around something like this that we had today. So I really enjoyed that process.